In this video, I'm gonna show you how you transform this image into this image by just using these 5 tricks. Hey all, I'm Gunter and I'll be showing you how you transform this image into this image with just using these 5 tricks into Lightroom. So let's dive straight into it and boost your own creativity. So this image has been shot at the Leuvense Kruidentuin in the tropical greenhouse. Specific settings are pretty easy. This one is shot with the Nikon D850, which is a full frame camera. It has 46 megapixels sensors size or whatever you want to call it, and because it is shot in a greenhouse, we didn't use any strobe on location. It was just during opening hours. We had the model, we had a makeup artist, we just went in, we looked for different angles and we just shot it. So nothing crazy going on there. And well, to be more specific for these settings, these are shot with a 16-35 lens from Nikon, which has its largest aperture at f4, so that means we cannot open it more than just f4. Now, in regards of technical settings, we've shot this at f4, a shutter speed of 1/160th of a second, and ISO 250. Now, after reviewing the images, I could have shot this at 1/80th of a second and just reduce the shutter speed to 125, even lower, depending on how steady I would be with my hand. Now, it is what it is. ISO 250 wouldn't be any issue on the camera in regards of noise. So we just did what we did. Since we are on a location, there's no time to like fuzz around a lot. We take our time, we shoot the images and we're gone. So that's one thing first. Now, to be more specific, we have the model turning her face to the light. So that means that if she was looking towards the camera, she would have had those eye bags. So we wouldn't want those eye bags. That's why we had her look up a bit. And that's why she also closed her eyes, because the sun was coming from the right side. You can see it on the reflection and the highlights on the plants in the greenhouse. The only unfortunate thing about this shot is the metal arrays that are running through the images, which are probably for the sprinklers in a greenhouse. And removing those would be too much of a fuss, because we have them crossing like all the trees and the plants. So we're not gonna fiddle about that. It is the location what it is, and it stays the way it is. Number one is we will be playing around with this image, and the goal is again to create this vibe in this image. Now, first things first, when we open up an image in Lightroom, we will be opening up the develop module. So we just click on develop. And then on the right side, we got all these panels going on. I'm just gonna close this one down to have a little bit more space. The same with the one below. Now, first tip, not really a tip, an extra tip, let's go with that. If you don't want to scroll through all the panels, you just right click and switch it to solo mode. So that way, the panel that you click on will be the only panel opening up. Pretty easy, because you don't have to start scrolling down all the time. So, first things first, we start working from above and we work our way down. Except for one exception, but that's in a later point. So, basic, the panel of basic. In the basic panel, we control exposure, shadows, highlights, and white balance. So, first things first, what I would suggest always is to start with the white balance as shot, but then we can go into auto and see what the camera, what Lightroom actually does. So you can see that what it does is it calculates the white balance to create a more magenta cast in the image, and it reduces the yellows in the image. Now, this could be a nice starting point, you never know. So there is one way to see, like, you can also play around with this little thing and just click around on the image. Now, because we clicked on green, the opposite is magenta, so that's why the image turned magenta. You can click on the skin color. So no matter where, if you got a gray area, you just click on it and then it neutralizes the image. Now, again, I'm gonna go with auto, but the white balance, normally when I'm on location, I set it manually because I don't want to change it up all the time. So that's number one. Just play around with auto and play around with the temperature of the image. Now that's again personal taste. I'm gonna boost it a little bit more to the yellow, but auto is just a fine starting point because this way it reduces the yellows in the image, since we will be introducing yellow at a later stage. So that's step number one. So number two. Number two is to play around with the exposure in the image to create the vibe you want to create. So for instance, if I want to go for a moody image, we reduce exposure and we just play around with it. Now, the first things we want to do in an image is make sure that the highlights are not blown out and that the shadows are not too dark. So we will be switching on these little arrows, and they show us when an image is under, or not under, but when it's no details in the shadows or the highlights. So on the left side here, you can see that the black starts to turn blue. That means there's no detail at all in the shadows. And when it starts turning red, there's no details in the highlights. So we have these sliders, highlight, shadows, whites, blacks, and those are the ones which control the actual how much we want to see it. So when I go to highlights and I reduce the highlights, you can see immediately that there starts to come details back into the highlights. This only works when you're shooting in RAW, because that's only a definition of 0 and 1s. If you shoot in JPEG, this will not be possible. So blown out will be blown out. Keep that in mind. So when we reduce the exposure a bit and we lift up the shadows quite a lot, like that, that should be a nice starting point. Now, I want to underexpose this image a bit. So that's what I'm gonna do. But I still want to keep detail in the shadow parts. Now on this side, on the little edge, you can see these are still a little bit underexposed. So I'm gonna boost it tiny bit, not too much. Because I also don't want to have the image to be too flat. So I'm gonna reduce it a tiny bit, because I still want a little bit of punch in it, but not too much. Again, personal taste, and this is how I retouch this image. So those are the settings. And then let's jump into the next number 3. Number 3 is all about colors. Now, colors define an image in a lot of different ways. That means it's up to you to decide what colors you want to use, but there is something that's called color theory. And what it does is it gives you suggestions about the use of colors, because there are different schemes in color, which makes our brain look at an image longer than if we would just do something with colors. Now, there is an easy tool online which you can go to, which is, let me just change my screen. So these are, it's color.adobe.com. It's from Adobe. It's totally free. And here on the left side, you got the different schemes that are possible. Like complementary means the colors are opposite on the color wheel. So, for instance, if we compare this, let's see if we can like make it a little bit smaller. There we go. We got the darker green. So if I click on an image, I can play around with the red, green, blue, and the brightness of an image. So I reduce the color. So this will probably be almost be the same as that. I know I can introduce magenta into some parts of the image. This way, we are using a complementary color scheme. Now, if we use monochromatic, that means that all the colors will be almost in the same color scheme. Now, if we change it to triangle, you can see the green gets these two colors. And the goal is to make them like be one of these schemes. It's up to you which you prefer personally, and you also have to think about the practical part. If you do this, that means that you have to be able to put those colors into the image, and there's no sense in making the skin of a person like blue just to have it compete with the scheme. Now, a color exists of three things. A color exists out of hue, saturation, and luminosity. Now, the hue is how much pigment, no, not how much, which pigment you want to start with. So which color you want to start with. The saturation is how much color you want to start with. And the luminosity is how bright or how dark do you want that color to be. So those three things can be found here. So we got the color, saturation, and luminosity. Luminosity is this one. Color is brighter or like more saturated, less saturated. And then we can play around with, let's see, we still have the hue. So if we change it, we change the hue. So that's the first thing. Now, we're gonna go for this one with an analog scheme. That means that the green we had was somewhere around there, and I'm gonna reduce the green a lot. And that means that we will be introducing like, let's see, just to be sure. Let's go with analog. So that means that this color, orange, starts to become really interesting to be used on skin tones. Now, if we compare this to the final image, you can see that this has the same vibe in it as mentioned in the color scheme. So we got green and we got yellow, which are analog color schemes. I know it's a lot about color, but it's really important to know which colors work well together, because it boosts the feeling of an image that much that, yeah, it just changes everything. Now, if I'm gonna go, so this was the image we started with. I'm gonna go to the final result just so that you can see what settings I've used. So the temperature was boosted to 7600. Tint just stayed the same. Exposure, I underexposed half a stop of light because, like I mentioned in the beginning, I wanted to boost it so that I got a lot of mood in the image. Contrast I reduced because we want to start with an image with not a lot of contrast in it, but just enough to have a certain vibe. Highlights, they stayed the same. I could reduce it a little bit more because they were popping out in red. Now they are gone. Yeah, there we go. The whites, I just kept them, and the blacks, I lifted them up. So plus 16 to make sure that there is still detail in them. Texture, that means how much texture you want in the image. And I've decided to go with plus 9 to boost a little bit more texture in it, because we want texture on the leaves in the picture. Dehaze is put more contrast or less contrast in the image. That's the easy solution. So I reduced it by -4. I boosted the vibrance a bit, and I reduced saturation quite a lot, so -18. Now, tone curve I didn't touch at all. This would be also the place where you create those contrasts in the image. But then we will be starting at the HSL sliders. Now, HSL, you can decide if you want to have them like this or you want them all. I prefer to have them all because that way I have a nice overview of them. But you can also do it like this, color, and then it gets split up into the colors. I prefer to have it this way. It's easier for me. But yeah, let's dive into colors, because that's one really important part of this image, like mentioned before. Now, you can see some things totally changed. So let's see what I did. The hue, like I mentioned, is which color you want it to be. So if we go with red, we can decide if we want the image to be the red tones in the image to be more yellow or more red, pinkish. I just left it. Orange. Normally orange is the color that is in the skin tone. I decided to reduce it, so minus 33. Then I boosted the yellows, because if we remember, analog color scheme, we want to boost the yellow a lot to import that yellow into the image. And then the rest of the colors, since there's no aqua, blue, purple, magenta in it, I didn't fiddle with it. And luminance is how bright you want the specific color. Like you can see the greens, if we lift them up, it changes the image entirely. So I'm gonna reset that. And yeah, that's about it for coloring. So now if you got a color in an image, and for instance you think, oh, that might be yellow, you change yellow, you don't see anything happen. Just take this little round picky tool, just click on it and go up or down, and you can see that it drags orange and yellows at the same time to change those colors. I'm gonna undo that by hitting Ctrl Command Z. So that is color. I know it's a lot, but most of the time it's just playing around with the colors and see where you end up with. There's not really an explanation. It's just like dragging to the extremes, see what it does, and then it's up to you to decide creatively what you prefer. Don't go anywhere. At the end, we're gonna throw in an extra bonus tip to create something special in Lightroom. So just keep watching, and let's jump into number 4 already. Number 4. So number 4 is, I'm just gonna go back to the original image. You can see it changing. So number 4 is that thing you see changing. It's about lens corrections. Now, lens corrections can work in your advantage or can work against you. So the only thing we're gonna check is remove chromatic aberration and enable lens correction, profile corrections. Now, normally it automatically detects what lens and camera you have used, so it adjusts the image. Now, sometimes when you click on it, you go like, oh no, what did it just do? That's totally personal. For this image, I like it to use the profile correction because it stretches the image out so that it has a little bit more of a wider feel to it instead of like the fish eye effect. So I'm gonna keep that. And if we go a little bit further into the transform, here you can start, playing around with it. Now, don't play around too much with it because it can deform a model that much that it starts to become crazy. Like, you can constrain crop so that it just keeps the... You can see that on the left side now, it stretches the image like crazy. So I'm gonna reduce this back to normal. So that's number 4. Just play around with it, and then you will see that in the end it enables the profile correction, and that just takes away sometimes the automatic vignetting on the edges, because sometimes the lens has white and black on the edges. It takes that away out of the image. So that was number 4. Just play around with it and see what it says. Number 5. Number 5 is one that gets overused a lot, and that is vignetting. So in the effects panel, you can play around with the vignetting. Let's jump straight into that one again. Let's reset the transform adjustments because it looks a bit funky. So the effects, we were at the effects. So we can put a vignette to it, but don't do it like this, because vignettes are used quite a lot, but they are used at a very high level. That means this is just too much. I know with a vignette, you can draw the attention to a model to a specific way so that the focus goes to a specific point in an image. Now, this is just way too much. So what I normally do is put a little bit of vignette on it. Not too much, but just enough to make the edges a little bit darker, and never ever do that. Never ever. Seriously, never ever do this. Always go with the black vignette and play around with it. It changes the image, but again, don't overdo it. And now, in the end, So this image had a little bit too much contrast in it, because if we boost colors, we also introduce contrast. Contrast is nothing more in a difference in brightness and darkness. So if we boost the colors, we introduce more contrast, and we want to take that away. So in the tone curve, I'm not sure, I think I did it in basic. Yeah, I did it in basic. I reduced the contrast a lot, because if we keep it like this, it's just too much, too heavy. So I reduced it to somewhere, let's see what it was, -28, to compensate for the contrast we introduced on the image. And then one of the final things, let's go with number 6, is if we have this calibration palette, and here the magic happens. That means you can change the entire feel of an image by just playing in this little segment. A lot of people go like, yeah, no, I don't touch it, I don't know. But if you play here, you can change like crazy the feel of an image. So the shadows, I went with a little bit more greenish shadows. The red, green, and blue, which are primary colors, are shifted. So I wanted the hue, instead of being more pinkish, be more yellow. And I wanted to boost the saturation quite a lot, because it was a little bit desaturated since we started in the beginning with -18. We wanted to boost that a lot. So that's the red. The green, greens are difficult. So that means if you push them too far, you get those dark greens, which look a little bit more fake on the image. And that's why I chosen to, instead of like going that way, I chose to go more to the yellow way. And if we remember what we said in the beginning, green, yellow are the colors we want to use. Since there is already a lot of green in it, I'm not gonna boost even more green in it. And then I boosted saturation by +2, so subtle changes. And the same with the blue primary. Like if I go that way, you can see that it just goes green like crazy. If I go this way, it starts to get that nice feel. And that's when, to a certain point that everything comes together as one image. Now, one of the things, which will be the bonus tip, you can see that something is going on in the background. Now, again, this is the bonus tip. If you've waited this long, here it is. So on this image, we don't have that. This has no lens flare at all. So we can introduce some lens flare in it by just using a radial filter in Lightroom. So the bonus tip is pretty simple. It's just a radial filter. You just drag it on the image, and then you underexpose it a bit, boost contrast, because if we have like lens flare going on, we know that there is no contrast in the image. So then we boost contrast to +100, and we reduce the highlights, we reduce the shadows to make everything really flat. And then if we have this, we can drag it around to a certain point that you go like, yeah, okay, this is cool. And I liked it on that spot. Now, don't introduce this and put it on the opposite side of the normal light direction. Just make sure that when you use this, it's subtle. It's not like crazy stuff going on. Make it subtle. So let's undo that. And just place it like, normally the light is coming from this side, the right side, onto her. But if I place it on that side, things become funky. Like somewhere around here. The attention goes away, because the attention goes to a point in the image where there is contrast. So we want to put it behind her, slightly behind her. So this way, when you look at the image, you go to the model, and then when you are on the head, you still see this little thing. So it creates some more depth in the image. Now, this is all I got to tell you about this image. So the things we've done, like I mentioned before, are just going from the top panel to the one on the bottom, and just change things slightly And in the end, you will see a pretty big difference. So left one is the one we've did now. Right one is the original one. So it is just a matter of what you prefer. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to go one step further, you can take this into Photoshop. So if that's something you would like to see in a future update, feel free to let me know below. And subscribe to the channel. Give me some love by hitting that notification bell, that thumbs up. And then I'll see you when I see you. Bye bye.